This is Haris Kruskic, BR Live's Combat Sports reporter, and today we're here with All Elite Wrestling's Aubrey Edwards. Aubrey, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing great. I'm 2 cups of coffee in, so I'm more than awake.
That's wonderful. Thank you for being up early. I know you're on the West Coast here, so I appreciate that.
All good.
So over the past year and a half during AEW's existence, you've kind of come out as one of the fan favorites of AEW, which is a little funny as a referee, right? It's a weird dynamic. First and foremost, how'd you start off as a referee?
The whole last year and a half has been an absolute blur. It's hard to think that it's been that long because it just feels like we started yesterday. And now it's like, oh no, we've been doing this for a while. It's kind of wacky. I started off as a referee. It's kind of a weird story. Before I was reffing, my sort of hobby was classical ballet, and I did that for 22 years. So I'm a little older than I think people realize, and dancers sort of have to retire a little bit younger than, say, wrestlers do, just because their bodies do start to break down. My feet are in horrible shape, all that kind of fun stuff. So I was looking to retire from dance anyway, and it's in that moment that I sort of realized how important performing was as a creative outlet, and I got super depressed. So I had a friend of mine who was a ref at a local indie promotion, and he had suggested I try reffing. And I was like, whatever, that could be cool, but I'm totally content just watching wrestling. And I tried it out. I was terrible initially, like real terrible. There's a lot you lose in wrestling when you're not watching it from the front. When you're watching it from the back, suddenly everything looks very different. But I kept practicing, eventually started doing some indie shows, and about 2 years in, I got contacted by AEW.
That's amazing, and here you are, quite the journey to get here, right?
Yeah, it's been very fast. I've been very fortunate from that. There's a lot of guys who have been grinding on the indies for a really long time. I think Bryce Remsburg and Rick Knox, 2 of our amazing refs, and Paul Turner as well. They've been doing it for well over 10, 15 years. So seeing as I'm 3 years in, I feel like a little baby, but I'm very grateful for everything so far.
You mentioned watching wrestling growing up. Who were some of your favorites?
I actually didn't watch wrestling growing up. I didn't start watching wrestling until about 8 years ago. I had no interest in it. My family made fun of it. It's fake, blah, 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 all that fun stuff. I only got into it because there was a WrestleMania, I think it was 27, where The Rock and Stone Cold were coming back. So all of my friends who would watch wrestling as kids were like, hey, we should watch this. So we made it a big old Super Bowl party with potluck, and we had prop bets and all that kind of fun stuff. But I literally knew nothing about wrestling. I'm Googling who The Undertaker is. I'm like, oh, this CM Punk guy is pretty interesting. Who's John Cena? Who's The Miz? Oh, wasn't he on The Real World? All of it's very just random and wacky. So I became a wrestling fan shortly after that. That was sort of the beginning of the reality era, CM Punk saying things on a microphone that are half scripted and half sort of alluding to real life. And it's in that moment that I realized wrestling is just another form of storytelling, a lot like dance in particular. So they're not as different as a lot of people think. It's just a different way of telling stories with your body than in a traditional sense.
Absolutely. So normally when you go on social media, it doesn't really matter who you are. There tends to be a lot of criticism, especially in the wrestling world. With you, I feel like it's not as much criticism. In fact, I feel like you've kind of won over much of the fan base in general. Would you say the same thing? And if so, how has the fan reaction to you been? How have you felt about it?
I get a fair amount of criticism, but I would say it's nowhere near the levels of, some of the other people, especially the wrestlers that are in the very, very forefront of everything. My favorite is I had someone once complain about the color of my lipstick as being too distracting, which is just hilarious because it's why are you paying attention to that and not the actual match? What's going on there? There's a lot of opinions about what a referee is and isn't in wrestling. And having another company that has been primarily dominant in the cable television space for a long time has kind of set the standard for what people expect of referees. And All Elite Wrestling has approached referees very similarly to how they're presented on the indies. They're their own characters. It's traditionally how referees have been presented before in the 80s and 90s. Earl Hebner is famous for being his own character, for instance. So when we started at All Elite Wrestling, I was talking to Paul Turner, who's our senior referee, and I said, hey, should we unify our count speeds? Should we, what should we be doing? Should we try and like be more similar? He's like, no, just do the thing that got you here. So we're actually encouraged to sort of be our own people and be our own characters. So you've got like Rick Knox, who's our tag team specialist. You've got Bryce, who's very overly animated. You've got me, who's stern face, pointy finger referee. So yeah, I get some criticism, but I don't think a lot of it is necessarily guided directly at me. It's more like the role of a referee. And after a year and a half, I think people are understanding what our product is and what it provides and how it's different and stands out from how wrestling has been traditionally presented. So I don't got it all that bad.
Absolutely. So last year at All Out, you made a little bit of history, becoming the first female referee to oversee a main event match at a major wrestling company. What was that moment like for you?
So that was crazy because that was like my career goal. And I didn't expect it to happen like 4 shows into AEW's existence. It was nerve-wracking. A lot of it is just like the pressure of this is Chris Jericho and understanding who he is and what he means to the industry, and like Adam Page as well, who's had a great career. But, you know, these two guys with this moment that's live in front of, I think it was like 12,000 people. It's like, yeah, that's a lot of pressure, but, you know, just do the thing that got you here. And I was really fortunate because both Jericho and Hangman Adam Page had requested me to be the referee. So that itself is sort of a confidence builder going into that moment, that they believed in me. So why shouldn't I believe in myself and that I'm capable of doing this? And ultimately, once the bell rings, it's just like any other match. So once I had confidently not held the title upside down, everything else was cake.
That's good. I recall this moment happening backstage because I was at All Out, and I noticed that you lifted the belt beforehand just to make sure to see how heavy it was.
Yeah, I practiced. Like it was the first time that belt was being held, and it's pretty heavy. It's well over 30 pounds. And a lot of the weight is all in the center. So being able to hold it upright to get a good picture, because this is like the first time it's being done, right? So I want to make sure everything looks good in every single moment. A lot of it is like finger strength and forearm strength. So you kind of have to hold it back a little bit, but also like hold it out. It was funky, and it's a little unwieldy as far as belts go. So I just wanted to make sure that like of all the things that could have gone wrong, like that variable was taken care of.
You're also involved with AEW Heels. What can you tell us about AEW Heels and what you'd like to do in the organization?
So AEW Heels is a female-centered community of wrestling fans. And one of the things that I've noticed as a female wrestling fan is that it's a very male-dominated industry, both from performer aspect, but also from a fan aspect. Like men 18 to 34 is sort of our core demographic. And part of what matters to me personally as a woman, and my background's in software, which is another male-dominated industry, is representation and having people that look like me on television, knowing that, you know, if kids see me on television, like, yeah, you can be a referee, you can boss around gigantic men, like you can do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. So for me, AEW Heels is a great thing because it brings female wrestling fans together. A lot of times it's hard to maintain interest in something if you don't have someone to share it with. And a lot of times female wrestling fans don't know other female wrestling fans. So to have these monthly events where, you know, over 100 people can get together on a call and talk with people on the roster and have cool events and see kind of things that are happening behind the scenes, like it's super awesome. And then recently, Leva Bates and I hosted our first ever game night. We're both pretty avid gamers. She's more of like a hardcore gamer. I call myself a casual gamer. I'm a big Mario and Yoshi fan. But we wanted to do something that was very accessible to a lot of people. So we ended up playing Quiplash. And it's just a nice way to find out that like everyone is unique and everyone has different interests. So yeah, it's a great way to bring people together, and we found a lot of success in it. I'm really, really happy that this is something that we're doing.
Very nice. You mentioned that your background is in software. Are you still pursuing that in any way? I know you're with AEW now, but is there still a little room for software?
So it's interesting because shortly after I became a referee full-time, I was offered a position as project coordinator at All Elite Wrestling. A lot of people wear multiple hats backstage and whatnot. So a lot of what my job as project coordinator is, it's essentially 2 parts. I have the podcast side, so AEW Unrestricted with Tony Schiavone, new episodes every Thursday. And then I've got sort of the software developer side. And we're not talking too much about it yet, maybe soon, but AEW's venturing into video games and whatnot. And prior to becoming a wrestling referee, I worked in video games for 10 years. So it sort of just made sense that given that this is my background, I should definitely be helping with this venture. So that's ultimately like how I spend my time on weeks we're not taping is I'm recording podcasts and I'm sitting in meetings and sending emails and reviewing things constantly.
Are you breaking some news for us with AEW video games? What's going on?
We've mentioned publicly that we're working on video games, but that's all I'm willing to say right now. You'll have to stay tuned.
All right, fair enough. And you mentioned the AEW Unrestricted Podcast. What's it been like working with Tony Schiavone? And could you have imagined doing that a year and a half ago?
So it's interesting because, as I mentioned, I didn't watch wrestling as a kid. So for me, Tony Schiavone is just a coworker. To a lot of people, he's the voice of their childhood, right? So I didn't fully understand in the moment, like, what that meant and how big of a deal that was. And now that I know more about Tony and who he is, I'm like, oh no, this is kind of a big deal. Like he's kind of been doing this a while and he's got like 12 billion podcasts of his own. He's doing all that. So it's a little interesting, but to me, he's just always been a peer. Like he's commentator, I'm referee. We talk about each other, you know, backstage. We work together to do the same thing. So a lot of like, we'll start like bickering and stuff. We'll make fun of each other, which is just like the normal relationship I have with a lot of my other friends. So with Tony on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of just like whatever. He's like any other coworker, but ultimately like that's kind of how people become. Like it was really nerve-wracking working with Chris Jericho the first time because he's this crazy like famous wrestler. And now every time I work with him, I'm like, hey man, cool, we're working together again. And he's like, all right, whatever. Just like jokingly. But yeah, it's like eventually everyone's just kind of normal people.
Absolutely. And be sure to tune into the AEW Unrestricted podcast. It's great. Aside from, I know the big moment for you was being the first female to oversee a main event wrestling match at a major corporation or major wrestling organization. What other favorite moments have you had at AEW?
Favorite moments I've had at AEW. My favorite match like ever across my whole career was the very first Fyter Fest with Cody and Darby. That was really important to me because that was like, when I originally came on to AEW, I was only on a per show contract. I came on just for Double or Nothing. So backstage at Double or Nothing, I find out from Cody is like, oh yeah, you're doing the next match. And I'm like, what are you talking? Does he know that I'm not booked for Fyter Fest? Like, okay, this is going to be a real awkward email to send. So it was sort of one of those, like my performance in the first show had brought me to that. And now there's more opportunities potentially showing up. On top of that, Darby's originally from the Seattle area. So me being out here and him being from out here, it meant a lot for what Seattle wrestling is, considering Seattle wrestling had basically not existed because of, it's a long story, but legal Department of Licensing, yada, 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 all that. But wrestling had finally started to kind of grow again in Seattle. So for us to both be on that big of a stage was kind of crazy. And then on top of that, it was one of the most complicated matches I've ever worked with, just because there were so many key story elements we wanted to have and all of that. So that was really huge. I'd say from another one, like Moxley winning the title from Jericho in Chicago, that was another huge one just because, you know, this is a major moment where some guy who had been continually winning his title defenses is suddenly dropping it to someone else. And whenever the company has faith in someone to carry the title, it's always this like big, exciting thing, right? And then the crowds in Chicago were just always insane. Like to hear the roar of the crowds in that building, it was wild. But also that happens to have like my favorite like clip that I send to people of me throwing out the inner circle, like Earl Hebner style. So that was super fun. There's a lot of particular memories. I'd say the other one is Sonny Kiss versus Cody for the TNT title. That was really important to me because I've started talking a little bit more about being openly bisexual. So for Sonny Kiss to have the platform that she did, to be able to have this match with Cody in a title match that was something that she had earned, for me to officiate it, it meant a lot for what the LGBTQ plus community looked like in that moment. And as I said before, like representation matters. It was a really big deal, and the match was really good too. So that's always a bonus.
Absolutely. Well, Aubrey, this was a wonderful time talking to you. Again, appreciate you very much for taking the time. And again, tune in to AEW Dynamite every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Listen and watch the AEW Unrestricted Podcast. You can hear it with Aubrey and Tony Schiavone. Aubrey, thank you so much again.
Thank you. This was a blast. I really appreciated your time.